how do you actually coach diet breaks to help the athlete understand what the goal is and the right mindset?
One thing that you mentioned with, when they may not be appropriate. I think another situation where I kind of hold off is if there's somebody that has a good bit of weight to lose, they may feel a little bit defeated when they come to you. Like, okay, I need to see something work in order to stick with it. And so at that point, unless they're feeling burned out, like I'm not going to suggest a diet break to them, because I think that positive momentum through the results is good. And I think once they're really kind of bought into like, okay, this is something I'm invested in, that, I'm going to see through, then I start to consider, okay, are we going to include diet breaks, either as a means to give them a psychological break and recharge, or as a means to practice maintenance. And I think their inclusion, I tend to include them more towards the end, simply because that's part of that transition. You're approaching that transition into maintenance. And, I think the same thing can be said for contest prep athletes is, most people can, have a pretty good stretch initially out of prep or getting into prep where they can, they're excited about the process. They're not feeling the negative effects of the fat loss yet from like a physiological perspective. They're not, sloth mode, like just not wanting to move, and I think at that point something can be said for just kind of continuing to roll with it. Maybe you go with a moderate approach with, some consecutive refeeds, something that's, I think, more in place to control the rate of loss. And then the prep moves on and you kind of get into that, maybe within, 50%, or you lose half the weight you need to. That's kind of when most people are going to start feeling it. Then I'll start either increasing refeed days to, use that as a tool to bring the rate of loss down. And then, include the diet breaks towards the tail end of prep, because I think it makes sense as you enter kind of that red zone of prep to be more proactive in having periods of maintenance just to recharge. And so I think as a whole, whether it be refeeds or diet breaks, like the further into someone's fat loss process they are in prep, the more I tend to use them.
Basically similar. Like usually it's like sitting down with someone for the first time and going over that big picture game plan or the trajectory of how we want to map this out. And the thing I think about is the rate of loss. Because I know in the earlier stages, you might be able to be a little bit more assertive, going for fat loss. So the diet breaks might not need to even be needed initially. Like Brian said, refeeds can kind of do the job as kind of like a bridge to get to that diet break. Because in theory, the longer we diet, your energy levels, your performance, the recovery, that's going to get more challenged. And someone's ability to handle stressors gets more challenged too. So at some point along the lines, those diet breaks become super important. In the way I like to kind of educate the athlete, or in a sense just kind of have them understand maybe a little bit easier. It's like I use a car analogy. It's like if we're driving a race car and we're going 100 laps, the tires start to wear down. You start getting low on gas. The engine might start to misfire a little bit. So you need a pit stop. You got to bring the car in to get new tires put on, get some more gas, get the engine tuned up. So that way you can get back on the track and be far more efficient. Your race time is going to be faster, but if you're just kind of gimping along on bad tires, like your lap time is going to go slower and slower and slower, and your car is going to start to really get jacked up, for a lack of a better term, like Brad would say. So yeah, it's like the diet breaks, like they'll get more important the deeper you get into a diet, whether you're on an extended fat loss phase or you're contest prepping. To me, I don't really treat those two things any different, because it's basically almost the same type of approaches. You have to factor in too, like the end goal is to not just lose body fat, it's to actually retain muscle mass. Like you want your end product to look muscular and, and be lean. So if you're over dieting or dieting too assertively and that rate of loss is too fast or what have you, you're going to end up looking flat, stringy, and not your best self. So those diet breaks are super important. The rate of loss is super important. And I think they just become even more important, like Brian was talking about, like in the later stages where obviously you're at a much leaner and fragile state.
For sure. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense from the perspective of contest prep, right? You mentioned the similarities, but the differences between a contest prep and any other type of diet is that you don't maintain what you get in contest prep, or you shouldn't, and for those who are following more general fat loss phases, in my opinion, unless you're just, getting your photo shoot done and you're like intending to basically treat it the same way a competitor would and regain weight, you're typically looking to sustain that fat loss. So while I think for the non-competitor, what we've talked about previously of implementing them kind of as needed is pretty important, but I also do think it conceptually makes sense, just like you would probably diet a little slower when you've only got 6 pounds of losable fat mass on your body compared to 26 pounds of losable fat mass on your body. You diet more quickly in the latter scenario and slower in the second. Other way around, sorry. You diet slower when you got less fat mass, folks. I don't know how to speak English. But yeah, same approach is you can slow down the rate of loss, like you said, Brian, and like you said, Jeff, by implementing time off from dieting.